Welcome to Philosophy 3400 Ethics. Today we're going to be looking at some of the later chapters of Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We're going to start in Chapter 6, work our way through Chapter 7. We'll have a look at a few passages as well in Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, and that will be that. Now I just want to start by reminding us that in Book 1, I want to point to two different sections of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, that we looked at a few weeks back. And I want us to see how Aristotle's returning to some topics from Book 1. He's also making good on a promise that he made in Book 1. So if you look at, I'm just going to go off memory here. If you look at Chapter 5 of Book 1, you'll see that Aristotle there discusses a variety of ways of life, basically. He says that many people consider to be the sort of conceptions of happiness, conceptions of ways of life that lead to happiness. And he mentions three in number, and then he actually adds a fourth. And one of them is, so we have the life of pleasure, the life of money-making, honor, or virtue. But he talks about the life of contemplation, and he says, we'll say more about this later. Here we are at the end of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10. This is where he says more. We also got into a little bit of filling out what the contemplative life might be, what contemplation as an activity that is the highest form of happiness for Aristotle might look like in Book 6, with a little bit of understanding how sort of what he calls contemplation is sort of our mind, or what the Greeks refer to as nous, grasping intelligible objects, which are in a sense instantiated or exist in material beings or even immaterial beings, depending on where you look in the universe, but which is a kind of intellectual activity of grasping the essence and the principles of things, and the natures of things. So we've learned a little bit about it from Book 6, but Book 6 also had dealt with what was called practical judgment, which is another intellectual activity, but is not necessarily having to do with theoretical reasoning so much. And so I just want to come back and look at in Book 10 at some of these chapters where Aristotle discusses contemplation in greater length. So let's have a look at this. Oh, and also, the other section of Book 1, Chapter 7, Aristotle discusses there how happiness is what he calls self-sufficient, autarkes, and complete, teleos. And so he comes back to these criteria for happiness. Anything we call any activity we're going to characterize as constituting human happiness had better be self-sufficient and complete. And self-sufficient means you're not relying on others. You don't need somebody else to do something for you for this activity to happen and be fulfilling. And secondly, completeness refers to the fact that nothing is missing. There's not some additional thing that if only you had that thing present, the activity would be even more rewarding. In other words, there's nothing left out. He comes back to that here in Chapter 6. So I want to begin by looking at the beginning here of Chapter 6, and it's, to me, reassuring, although it can also possibly be disturbing or confusing if you're sort of at the end of this whole book in some of the last chapters, and Aristotle begins a chapter as he does, Chapter 6 here on page 190 at 1176 A30 or so. But let's look at how Aristotle begins this. Now that we've talked about the virtues and friendship and pleasures, what remains is to go through and outline what has to do with happiness. It's comforting to me that here at the end of the book, Aristotle still feels that he has yet to successfully outline happiness, or to at least draw the conclusions from his discussion of virtues and friendships and etc., how we are then to integrate all this other material into the overarching theme of the whole work, which is human happiness. So we still have to figure out, right, what happiness is. Now, he's going to review. He says, we said that happiness is not an active condition. If you look at page 90, it's not an active condition. Um, you hear the idea. And so, Aristotle's not always entirely consistent. At times, he has claimed that virtue is an active condition. And I guess that's true of virtue. Virtue is an active condition. This is what's important here. And it's incredibly important, a subtle point here, but crucial for understanding Aristotle. Happiness is not an active condition, but virtue is. For example, right, I have the virtue of being able to read ancient Greek, right? But for that to, and that's an active condition in me. If there's ancient Greek present, I am trying to make sense out of it, right? But here's the deal, right? If ancient Greek is not present to me, if I lose all the books I have that contain ancient Greek, if I don't have a library I can go to and find ancient Greek text, I would still have the active condition, but I wouldn't actually have the activity itself of reading Greek. I would have the ability to do so, but I wouldn't have any way to realize that potential. And so I think this is what he's getting at here. Happiness is not an active condition. Virtues can be active conditions, but happiness involves the enactment, right? The realization of virtue, the fulfillment of potential. We said that happiness is not an active condition since it could then be present in someone who is asleep throughout life, right? Not exactly, Aristotle, of course, not exactly. You'd have to, I think, develop into a virtuous adult, right? And then fall into a coma, essentially, throughout your whole life. Because, again, you would need to have the virtues as active conditions. You would need to have been educated, developed to do the right things and be ready to do them, and then all of a sudden something bad could happen, like a coma, right, for example. Living the life of a vegetable. Sure, that's how Aristotle talks about it, and to me it'd be something like going into a coma. Or in someone suffering the greatest misfortunes, right, or again, right, somebody who's been well raised, who has all the ingredients of happiness we saw from Aristotle's rhetoric, all the wealth and health and a good family and etc. And let's say they're just about to sort of enter into their adult life and start to make things happen and realize all the virtues that have been instilled in them. But then what if a series of terrible misfortunes happen, right? Terrible car wreck, and then other sort of health issues befalling you, and then this, that, and the other thing. People in your personal life maybe betraying you, and so on and so forth. All the sort of bad things that can happen to a person, right? Despite that person being a good person. And I think that's what he's getting at here, is even there, right? You would have virtues present as active conditions ready to manifest themselves. And yet if you're suffering the greatest misfortunes, you're not going to be happy, right? Okay. So if these consequences are not satisfactory, and of course they're not, right? We don't want to say that a person is living a fulfilled life, a person who's not even conscious, or a person like Socrates, who seems to be suffering misfortunes at the end of their life. Aristotle, can be seen here as correcting a kind of a view in Plato, right, that Socrates can never be made unhappy by the actions of ignorant and misguided fools in his community. So in other words, they can sentence him, they can find him guilty for corrupting the youth, they can sentence him to death, they can place him in jail, they can order him to ingest poison. What they can't do, according to Plato and Socrates, is make him unhappy, or make him do the wrong thing, which for Socrates is equivalent to being unhappy, make him into an unjust person. Now for Aristotle, though, to suffer these misfortunes, to be found guilty of a crime, to be placed in jail, to be executed, he thinks these are actual real misfortunes, and a person undergoing them cannot be called happy or fulfilled. So if these consequences are not satisfactory, but one ought instead to place happiness in some form of being at work, that is, it's an activity, it's something you do, hopefully regularly, hopefully every day. And among ways of being at work, some are necessary. and are chosen for the sake of something else, and these will not be good candidates at all for happiness as an activity. If you're doing something because you have to, it's, Aristotle's intuition here is we probably shouldn't call that the fulfillment of your nature. It's merely something that must be done so that something else that you really want to do and that really fulfills your nature happens. So many people who work for a living and sort of live for the weekends might understand what he's getting at here, right? I go to work and I earn a paycheck because it's necessary, but it's only when I have time off and I've cashed that paycheck and have some spending money that I can then do some of the things I actually want to do with my time, perhaps, right? Okay. Now, so we still have these issues then. Happiness is not an active condition. It requires realization, enactment. It's an activity that must be done. It's not the ability to do something if circumstances are right. It's actually the doing of it. Now, he's going to consider an alternative here that he thinks meets these criteria for happiness. That seems like maybe this is the answer to the question. What happiness is? Happiness is to play, right? Playing, right, is something that is not chosen, he says, for the sake of any other thing. Of course, you can play games for the sake of other things. You can go to Las Vegas and play the game known as poker for the sake of for the sake of winning money. You can play games in a casino, right, with the intention of making money, right? So you walk out of there without the money that you came in with, and you probably aren't feeling very good. Why? Because you weren't there to just enjoy the games. You were there to actually win. We can also imagine games, and we don't have to imagine them. We see athletes, professional athletes playing games. Are they doing it for the love of the activity itself? Not exactly. They like to get paid. They want to be famous, so forth. So let's just look at what he's talking about here with play, because the idea is something like, wouldn't this be a perfect candidate for the activity that we are calling happiness? An activity where nothing's missing, an activity where you do it for its own sake, an activity where you realize your rational potential as a human being, use your mind, your creativity, but that also makes use of other goods that Aristotle identifies, such as health and strength. So, why not just end with the advice? If you want to be happy, find a game you enjoy playing and play that game regularly. Now you have the answer, right? What do I do with my life? Find a game you really enjoy playing and make it a regular part of your life. Find multiple games. So let's look at why Aristotle's ultimately going to conclude that's not a good approach. So, the pleasures, Aristotle claims here on page 190 at 1176b, line 9 or so, the pleasures that come from playing are not chosen for the sake of any other things. People want to enjoy those pleasures simply intrinsically in the game, right? You don't go, even here we can think of possible objections. Somebody could say, look, I go and play soccer not for the sake of the game itself, because after all, moving the ball around the field with other adults or something is just a silly thing to do, but I do it for my health. Nonetheless, I think, when we think about people who play games, soccer, for example, or other games, and do it regularly, usually the person does actually enjoy that activity itself, right, and really finds it fulfilling, and isn't doing it for something like pay or merely for, to stay in good shape. After all, you can go to a gym. There's many ways to sort of exercise and keep yourself in shape. You don't have to play some specific game. So in other words, there must be something about the playing itself that is really fulfilling. So the pleasures, Aristotle claims, that come from playing are not chosen for the sake of other things. People want to enjoy those pleasures for their own sake, right? So why do you like, or you describe the pleasure you feel playing some game, and the idea is that these pleasures are unique to these games, and that's why people really play them, right? Is you don't get these pleasures elsewhere, and they are rewarding. Now he's going to say people are harmed by them more than they are benefited, since they neglect their bodies and their property. I mean, again, it depends what kind of games we're talking about and what the customs and conventions are. But what he's getting at here is you can become obsessed or addicted to sort of game playing in the sense that you'll harm your, your health or even your wealth, right? It'll take away your money eventually, possibly, or destroy your health if it's a game that doesn't really involve your whole body moving or something regularly, right? So if you just we would think about video games here, clearly something that didn't exist in Aristotle's time, right? But if you spend all your time sort of looking at a screen and you're not getting any physical activity, you can imagine that could destroy your health in a sense, right? Not good for your health to spend your, most of your day or something just doing that endlessly. Now he says, many of those who are considered happy escape into pastimes of various kinds of play. And for this reason, people who are charming in such ways of passing the time, so in other words, people that bring fun and games into some setting, are highly regarded around tyrants, for they display themselves to the latter as pleasing in those things which they aim at. So now he's going to connect this impulse to play with tyranny, and I think it's a strained connection. I don't think it's very convincing at all, frankly, but he's not wrong that among the politically powerful, and especially among tyrants, circuses, and the Romans have this expression, bread and circuses. There's this, one way to stay in power as a tyrant is to surround yourself with people who are good at running festivals and games. And this sort of provides the people in your community with with activities that enrich their lives and make them more likely to support the tyrant staying in power. Nonetheless, I don't think there's any necessary connection between game playing and tyranny, whatever Aristotle might say here. Now, he's saying these pastimes it seems that such pastimes, game playing, is conducive to happiness, because those who are in power spend their leisure playing such games. But perhaps such people are no indication, since virtue does not consist in having power, nor does intelligence, and the activities that are of serious worth come from these. Well, that's fine, Aristotle. That's absolutely fine, but here's the deal. Playing games is not necessarily connected to tyrannical power, and it's also not necessarily connected to a lack of intelligence either. So Aristotle's making some assumptions about game playing that I think are rooted in his experience and maybe his culture of the time. Games, and this reminds me that, the ancient Greek word for games comes right out of the ancient Greek word for a child. And so there's a sense in which the Greeks necessarily conceive of games as something children do, as not suitable for adults. I think there's an undercurrent here running through Aristotle's analysis, and just to be completely clear here, he's entirely wrong about this. Game playing is something that human beings do at all points of their life, insofar as they're able to play games and they retain their, physical ability to play the game, their cognitive abilities. This is something that humans do from their earliest childhood memories all the way until the end of their lives. Please don't go into a nursing home today. But if the pandemic ever ends and we're out of this nightmare scenario we're in, if you visit a nursing home to volunteer and provide companionship, say to people there that are going through the end of their lives, what you'll see in nursing homes is there are common rooms where people come together and play games like bingo and card games and all manner of games, which means people in their 70s and 80s enjoy playing games together as much as 2- and 3-year-old children do, and people throughout their lives play games of various sorts. Usually it's ubiquitous and pretty common. Okay, so I'm not going to just go through this and sort of agree with Aristotle here, but let's just, because here's the thing. In chapter 6 of book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle criticizes Plato, and he starts by saying, Plato was my teacher, I respect Plato, he was a great teacher, I learned a lot from him. However, just because he's my friend doesn't mean I have to agree with everything he says. If I think something's true and it's at odds with Plato's view, I'm going to be loyal to what I think to be true and not loyal to my friend Plato. I've spent a lot of time reading Aristotle. I've written on Aristotle. I enjoy reading Aristotle. Sometimes I think Aristotle's wrong, and I'm not afraid to say that, and that's okay. Aristotle is a wonderful thinker, very amazing figure in the history of philosophy. He's also wrong about a number of things. Sometimes he's quite obnoxiously wrong too. It happens to the best of us. So, I just want to say something on behalf of play here against Aristotle's point that somehow play is not serious enough to be a candidate for human happiness. So the activities, he says, that are of serious worth come from things like intelligence, using your mind. And he says, if those people run off to bodily pleasures because they have no taste for pleasure that is pure and suited to people who are free. And I guess one thing we can get here is, game playing here is very much a matter of physical activities and athletics, apparently. I mean, there were some dice games and board games, primitive versions of this in antiquity. But he's just not thinking very much of intellectual games, of games that require our minds and our imaginations and whatnot, which is unfortunate, right? So he's missing out on sort of a whole realm of games here that don't necessarily involve a bunch of bodily pleasures, but could involve mental and intellectual pleasures as well. Now, so he's ultimately he's going to say something like people who enjoy playing games are low class, essentially, is what he's getting at here, and they like cheap bodily pleasures because they have no conception of higher pleasures. And my response here is you have no conception, Aristotle, of higher order games that might be more than just moving a ball around the field. I mean, that is a game. That's a fairly common type of game, right? Or something like the Olympic Games, even, and activities such as wrestling and boxing and the mix of both of those things into a kind of mixed martial arts they call pankration, and also horse racing, right? The precursor to car races. All these things were present there in Greece. These were games that involved, primarily your body, but also if we think about something even as simple as boxing or wrestling, I mean, it needs to be said. I'll quote the boxing trainer Teddy Atlas, who used to be a commentator on boxing matches on ESPN for decades, and he would commonly say that 75% of boxing is mental, is what he'd say watching a fight. In other words, you have to use your mind, even if you're in a boxing ring. It's not just a matter of you train and you're hitting some heavy bag and then you just go into the ring and your body just does what it does or something. You have to have what they call a ring IQ, right? There's intelligence involved. Fighters have to use their minds, and if they are not so good at that, that gets exposed in the ring by somebody else who outwits and outsmarts them and utterly neutralizes them. So in other words, there's a kind of false dichotomy here, right? Either a type of game playing that's entirely physical and unintelligent, or some more noble activity that's not even game playing that uses our intelligence. And what I want to say is we don't have to accept that false dichotomy. Wrong, Aristotle, you're wrong. What we can do is we can say there are types of play and games that require us to use our intelligence that are not just about cheap, vulgar bodily pleasures, but they could involve bodily pleasures as well, right? Even if they are common, right? A feeling of euphoria with your body sort of in motion, realizing its ability to stretch out and grasp things and whatnot and catch something. Right? Okay. So, let's continue on then. Now, here's his point. Even children believe that the things valued by themselves are the best things. So he's really connecting, and again, it's there at the level of language for the Greeks. And so it's natural, and it belongs to how they view the world for them at this time. Fortunately, we're not living in ancient Greece, having to accept these assumptions here. But the idea is, is that play is an activity best suited for children, and those who play as adults are essentially, for Aristotle, living like children, regressing to some sort of childlike state. And like children, he says, they're going to think they know it all when they don't. They're going to think they have it figured out, right? This is the coolest thing to do, when it's not. Okay, so he says, it is reasonable that just as different things appear worthwhile to children and to men, so too different things appear worthwhile to people of a low sort and to decent people. You can clearly see here this is a kind of class elitism, snobbishness, right? And it frankly is obnoxious as far as I'm concerned. It's not convincing at all. But nonetheless, he's not, I mean, and here's the thing, he's not wrong, right? That, people can, from different backgrounds, can view things differently. An example, right? So let's just give an example that would support Aristotle's point here in some sense. That would, if Aristotle were alive today and he wanted to make his point more strongly against me and against my objections here, he would say something like, let me tell you something, Professor Turner. Here's what I mean, okay, with this distinction between people of a low sort and decent people. There's a game that people play in your country, Professor Turner. They play it every day, millions of people. It's called the lottery. And he says, this game appears worthwhile to people who are generally drawn from the lower classes or working classes because they're not able to calculate, just like the folks who frequent casinos, right? That the reason casinos and the lottery exist is because the system has figured out a way to profit from people's hopes to win, basically. In other words, right, statistically, you have a very low chance of winning the lottery or of winning at slots or of winning at the roulette wheel, etc., right? And the casinos know this, the people who run the lotteries know this. This is how they make their living and how they make this into a profitable enterprise. And so he would say, an educated person either would not be in the casino at all, knowing what the statistics are, or perhaps might know how to count cards and whatnot, and then would be essentially not cheating, but being very strategic and finding a way to win that wouldn't be dependent on chance. Anyways, that would be his kind of comeback here. Would be the lottery is an example of what I mean. Okay, and you can see who plays the lottery, who doesn't play the lottery, and what you'll notice is this is a kind of rigged game that largely exists to separate the vast majority of people from their money, but then that doles out a prize here and there and makes a big deal out of it so that everybody feels like, there's some chance they have of winning, which is not wrong. You have a chance of winning the lottery. It's just you probably have a greater chance of being struck by lightning twice in a single day, in some cases, than you do of winning the lottery, especially some of these Powerball ones. Anyways, the idea being, there's an example, right, of games that that can be more frivolous, that can not really, it's not very much fun, is it, to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars a year just to scratch off tickets and lose constantly, right, or not win. So, what he's getting at here is we should not be guided by the pursuits of low people. Again, I find that to be obnoxious. And I also find this distinction of low and decent to be questionable, as though people, from the educated or upper classes are not capable, are not often scoundrels themselves, right? So, nonetheless, right, this is going to be Aristotle's conclusion, so let's look at this at page 191, 1176b, line 28 or so. Therefore, so now we know Aristotle's trying to draw a conclusion from what he's reasoning here. Therefore, happiness does not consist in play. Why, Aristotle? For it would even be absurd for our end or the goal of our life and all of our activities to be play. He says it would be absurd for the goal and the end point of our lives to be play, and to work hard and undergo troubles all through one's life for the sake of playing. Why would this be absurd? Well, he thinks, all that toil should be in the service of something that sort of is of a different order than that toil, better, that makes it all worthwhile, etc. And I guess his conception of play is that it's something that, low-class people addicted to bodily pleasures or children do, roughly speaking. And that doesn't seem dignified enough for him to be the goal of your life. You do all this hard work all just to jump and dance around a field and move a ball from one side to the other. Is that why you're working 60 hours a week or whatever? Or is that why for Aristotle, you would spend all your time, not engaged in necessary work, but important work for your community, maybe being a leader of your community politically? He says, would you spend all your time doing all this serious work than just to go and play a game? Now, of course, in the United States today, people do this, right? Senators, congressmen, congresspersons go and play games when they're not working. Okay, they even have like a softball league, or at least they used to. So, sure, Aristotle, people do a lot of serious work of importance, and then play. But okay, he says, again, he thinks it's absurd that you would do all this hard and difficult but necessary or valuable, rewarding work and make a better life possible for people in your community, all just so that when you're not doing that, you can sort of fully realize your ambitions, your potential by playing a game. Now, we choose everything, he says, for the sake of something else except for happiness. Happiness is the one activity we choose for its own sake. And that it seems as though play is an activity chosen for its own sake. And you can certainly find people who seem to be doing everything they do and choosing everything they choose just so they can set themselves up to enjoy playing in certain situations. And then they fully kind of fulfill themselves in that activity. To be earnest and to labor for the sake of play seems foolish and too childish, but to play in order that one might be serious, as Anacharsis says, seems to be right. Now he's, in my view, misreading Anacharsis here, but nonetheless, it's a pretty simple idea, right? If you work hard, you should play hard. And if you take play seriously in a sense, he says the way to take it seriously is to treat it as an opportunity for a kind of recreation, and as something that will allow you to come back to your serious tasks in life with more energy and with a more successful approach. And so it's a kind of, you get wound up and there's a kind of tenseness and stress to your serious work, and then play is the way that you sort of recover and get back to work more successfully afterwards. Relaxation, in a sense, right? Play seems like relaxation, and people are incapable of constantly doing serious work, and so they need to relax, and play would then be a form of this, right? So in other words, he says relaxation, though, notice, right, people don't work just so that they can relax. In a sense, they're relaxing so they can work, and he says this is how it is with play. We don't work so that we can play. We play so that we're able to work, something along those lines. So that'll be his attempt to sort of find a place for the activity of play that he thinks is more proper to it. It's a form of relaxation. The happy life, he says, and I think he would also say, for children, it's also a way of socializing them and educating them when they're very young, or when they're not able to sort of sit and pay attention for very long. Whence these sort of activities that take place in various classrooms for various reasons like this, just to sort of get people up and moving around, recess and whatnot at school. So relaxation should not be the end of our lives, since it comes about for the sake of being at work. Why do people relax? So that they can then do work that is stressful, in a sense, right? So, a happy life seems to be in accord with virtue. This involves seriousness and does not consist in play. Again, we're going to have a hard time necessarily buying this. I mean, part of the issue for me, at least I have a hard time with this, is the idea that play and seriousness are mutually exclusive. It's just deeply implausible to me, that hypothesis. I'm not an ancient Greek Aristotle. I don't have this etymological connection. My word for play is not the same word that means childish things, essentially, as the Greeks, right? Paideia. Paideia, childish things, not to be confused with paideia, education, serious business for children. But in any case, right, not being an ancient Greek, not being somebody for whom ancient Greek is my first language, I'm just not seeing, here's the thing, we're going to have a Super Bowl this weekend. I'm dating, obviously I'm recording this prior to when you're going to be viewing this, but here's the deal, this is just prior to the Super Bowl, and we could think of this in terms of something like the Super Bowl, right? That's a game, and there are grown men playing that game, and they will be playing the Super Bowl, okay? Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes are going to be throwing a ball to other men, and hopefully some of those men are going to try to catch it, other ones are going to try to knock it down, and people are going to be tackling each other, and it's a game, right? When people tackle each other, they don't continue fighting until somebody is unconscious. They get up and they do another play, and they sometimes pat each other on the backs and etc., right? But here's the deal. They're pretty serious about it too. Okay, very serious. In fact, I imagine right now Tom Brady is incredibly serious about winning another Super Bowl, because um, he's middle-aged like myself, and he doesn't have much time left. And so, in other words, like, this is incredibly serious to somebody like Tom Brady, and to many of the people on that football team down there in Tampa Bay, for whom this is like a final kind of chance maybe for them, for many of them to play and win this game. You have this other team that won last year that's trying to win again. There are people planning and strategizing. There are people waking up early in the morning thinking about what to do. It's an incredibly serious business, and they're playing at the same time. And you can go to any sort of playing field in the country and find versions of this. Are they just there playing? Yes. But are they taking what they do seriously? Oftentimes, yes. Very seriously. People train. They practice. They think about it. They plan about it. They dream about it at night. And when they don't win, for example, they take that seriously. It affects them emotionally. They struggle and strive to improve, and so on, right? So in other words, I'm having a hard time sort of buying, accepting this conception of play that, is wanting to rule out any kind of seriousness, right? So he says, we speak of serious things as better than those that bring laughter and involve play. Do we? It depends. It depends on the laughter and the play in question, okay? I can't think of a more serious business than being an intelligent stand-up comedian who makes incisive, critical points about social norms and prejudices and racism, right? And yet that activity, what is it? Is it serious? Is it playful? It's both. All right, so enough about that. All just to say, as you can see, I want us to resist Aristotle's account here of play. I think it's interesting and influential and profoundly mistaken. Okay, and I have argued as much in writing. All right, so let's move forward here. I've spent a lot of time on chapter 6, as you can see. It's the thing that really intrigues me here. But I want us to look a little bit into chapter 7 and some of these later chapters to get a better sense here about what Aristotle means by contemplation. So, in chapter 7, at the beginning here on the bottom, page 191, 1177, A11, A12 or so, if happiness is being at work as this kind of activity in accord with virtue, an activity that we are doing well in some sense, it is reasonable, he says, that it would be in accord with the most powerful virtue. And this would belong to the best part. So now he's going to sort of, this is what's a little bit tricky here, because we seem to have levels now to happiness, and the sort of level that involves virtues like courage and justice and interacting with other people every day and doing stuff together. That involves practical judgment too. Seems like we're now calling this some sort of lesser version of virtue and happiness. It's not entirely wrong here. He does seem to be suggesting that intellectual virtue is the most powerful. And so if happiness is an activity that is virtuous, and if we want happiness to be sort of the best version of happiness we can find, then we're going to try to identify the most powerful virtues or virtue, and then happiness is going to be the activity where that virtue is enacted. So what is this best part? It's going to be what he calls nous, right? Our mind. And then the activity itself will be contemplation. The virtue of this will be something like perhaps wisdom. That this way of being at work, he says, is contemplative, has been said. We get references here from Joe Sachs going all the way back to Book 1. This would seem to be in agreement with the things said before and with the truth. So in other words, Aristotle's really starting to commit himself here. This way of being at work is the most powerful, since the intellect is the most powerful of the things in us. He's not wrong about this, right? Why are human beings the most powerful animals on this planet? It's not because we have the strongest muscles. We certainly do not have the sharpest teeth. I do not have claws, even if I let my fingernails grow for a while. I don't have claws capable of piercing through heavy fur and natural forms of armor. In other words, we're pretty, fragile and frail creatures. It takes a long time for young to become mature, we're just not very well endowed by nature in terms of, power and physical prowess. And so, what is the source of human power, you might say, over nature, over other animals, etc.? What would it be? Well, it's our intelligence, it's our minds. This is the real source of power and strength. Knowledge is power, as Francis Bacon puts it. Okay, so the intellect is the most powerful of the things in us, and the things with which the intellect is concerned, sort of the eternally true things about the world we live in, right? That I've sort of tried to encapsulate with a formula like E equals mc squared, or matter is neither created nor destroyed, or something cannot both be A and not A at the same time in the same respects, and whatnot. So the things with which the intellect is concerned are the most powerful of the things that can be known. In one sense is, these first principles, such as the law of non-contradiction. The idea is, why is this more powerful than other things that can be known? Because it's prior, in a sense. It's prior not temporally, but logically. And the idea is something like, the principle of non-contradiction, principle or law of non-contradiction, is sort of simpler, more basic, and universal. And with that principle, then, we can sort of know a lot of things. Like I can know that the door to this room, I can't see the door to this room, but I can know that the door to this room is either open or closed right now. And I can know that it cannot be both open and closed. I mean, it's not a great piece of knowledge to have about the world, but there's something I can know on the basis of the principle of non-contradiction without even having to look and see, right? And there's going to be infinitely many things that may be known on the basis of these kinds of principles. Now, it is also the most continuous, he says. This way of being at work using our intelligence is the most continuous activity. What he means is we can do this more than we can do other activities, and that is evidence for Aristotle that because we can do this activity more continuously and for longer stretches of time without becoming exhausted and etc., that's evidence that this is our fundamental nature, and that by doing this activity we are realizing our nature. Right, and so he's going to talk about pleasure, and I think one of the things he's going to get at here on these pages is, take something like, you might think sensual pleasure is happiness, and is there anything more enjoyable than drinking alcohol and eating a bunch of roasted meat or something like this, right? So imagine that, right? That's your idea, that, what is it that makes you happy in life? It's, a keg full of beer and giant spits of roasting meat, and you just want to eat meat, drink beer, and maybe, I don't know, whatever else. And here's the deal, right? With something like that involves a certain kind of pleasure, right? The pleasure of eating that food and drinking that alcohol. Now here's the thing that Aristotle wants to point out. You can't do that all day long, every day. Or, you can try. You'll die after a few years or something like this, or become incredibly unhealthy and have to change what you're doing. And so that's evidence for Aristotle that that kind of activity can't be the realization of our fundamental nature. Because if it were, right, why would it lead to these sort of unpleasant, unsavory, and undesirable outcomes? Now, for Aristotle, right, to enjoy pleasures like that, the pleasure of eating and drinking requires a sort of intellectual virtue of a kind. We have to use our minds to establish moderation. So the idea is you can enjoy things like fatty meat and alcohol, and you can enjoy them in a more sustained manner over a long period of time precisely by exercising moderation. So if you do enjoy something like eating roasted meat and having some beer, if you really enjoy it, you have to use your intelligence to be able to enjoy it responsibly so that you can enjoy it more, frankly, over a longer period of time, over your entire life, if you enjoy it in moderation. If you do not enjoy it in moderation and you just think happiness, so in other words, for Aristotle, then your happiness lies in exercising the virtue of moderation in that domain, as opposed to the actual feelings of pleasure on your taste buds as you eat the meat, or the feeling of intoxication as you have several alcoholic beverages in succession or something. Now, what he's getting at, though, is sensual pleasures, whether we think of the act of lovemaking or sex, whether we think of, drinking enjoyable beverages, whether alcoholic or non-alcoholic. We think of our favorite foods and eating them, right, and going up for seconds and having more. What he's going to get at here is all those forms of pleasure are, if you think about doing them over a long period of time, they are no longer pleasurable. They become painful and they become like torture. That is evidence then that simply doing these things as much as we possibly can is not the path to our happiness, but actually can destroy us. In contrast, Aristotle wants to say the kinds of pleasures associated with intellectual activity are sustainable. You don't destroy, he thinks, your body by engaging in these for sustained periods of time. And the question I would have for him, because here's the thing I was thinking, is if you're always contemplating things, it seems like you would be neglecting your body. So couldn't we object to Aristotle? Well, you want us to just use our reason, our minds, our imaginations, and to contemplate the eternal truths that sort of underlie our physical universe. Well, what are we doing with our bodies when all this is happening? Are we neglecting our bodies? Are we just kind of sitting and staring up at the sky? Are we always in a sort of classroom setting? Well, Aristotle's school is called the Peripatetic school of ancient philosophy, and so I'm reminded that it's built into the name of Aristotle's very school of philosophy. The idea that when you practice philosophy, you do so while you walk around. So peripatetic literally means, walking, characterized by walking around, going all over the place and walking through the gardens of the Lyceum. And so I think, he does conceive of contemplation and the use of our intelligence as the highest form of human activity, but it is also consistent with using our bodies too. It's something we should do as we walk around. That is, we shouldn't just be sitting in a research library or in an office locked away from the world. We should actually be out there observing the world and moving through it and walking and engaging our bodies and our senses as well. Okay, good enough with that. Let's move forward here. I just want to look at this last point in closing. I've gone on for too long, and that will limit what we can do then today. But I want to, in closing, look at some passages in chapter 8. Top of 194, right at 1178a 22 or so. Aristotle writes, but the happiness that belongs to the intellect is separate. It's sort of set off from other things and is pure in a sense and contained in itself. Let this much be said about it, for to be precise is something greater, right? And yes, see the metaphysics indeed. And what we're getting at here is something kind of mystical that happens in the action of contemplation. Look, it's not that complicated. You lose all sense of time. right? And in losing all sense of time while you're engaged in this activity, there's a sense in which you exist in a kind of eternity. Anybody who's ever been so wrapped up and so full of enjoyment and so full of attention towards what they're doing that they forget all about what time it is, lose all track of time, feel like, that there is no time passing at all, and, can be shocked when they're finally confronted by what time it is, by the fact the sun is going down or something, right? Is in this kind of state. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of a mystical experience here. Okay. But here's the point. He says, it would seem to have little need of external props, or less than virtue of character has. Here's one other reason why he thinks the life of contemplation is preferable to a life of sort of political activity, where you're enacting sort of political virtues like justice and courage and etc. with other human beings in a community. Theoretical virtue and the contemplative life, he's claiming, require less external goods. We don't need to have all these external goods. We don't need as much wealth, is one thing he's going to get at, for example. And so you don't need, for instance, to worry so much about being generous in gift giving when you're devoted to the contemplative life. You're not trying to win friends and influence people with a series of gifts as transactions. Instead, you're just devoted to this activity of contemplating the truth of what exists in reality and of understanding the principles that underlie phenomena. Right, he says, a generous person needs money to perform generous acts, and so will a just person for paying back what is due. And here's the idea, right? And so that requires things like wealth. A courageous person will need strength, right? You're going to jump into the water and save someone. Well, hopefully you've been swimming recently and you're in good shape. If he is to accomplish any of the things that go with this virtue, right? And so he's going to go, this is always true of all these kinds of political, practical virtues. But it's not true of theoretical virtue. It's not true of contemplation. For someone who contemplates, this is right around 1178b, for someone who contemplates, there is no need of strength necessarily. You don't have to be muscular here. There's no need of wealth, right? Why? Because he says, one might say, they get in the way of contemplating. Insofar as he is a human being and lives in company with a number of people in a sort of academic setting or something like this at the time, in a school like the Lyceum or the Academy, he chooses to do the things that have to do with virtue and thus has little need of such things in order to live, and thus will have little need of such things in order to live a human life. So what he's getting at here is, insofar as you are a contemplator, you need very little of these external goods. But insofar as you must then live in a human community, and so even a school of philosophy like the Lyceum is outside of Athens, the idea is that by devoting yourself to contemplation and by cultivating the intellectual virtues, you have a sort of very cheap, it's a free kind of activity, and it's not going to require things like wealth or strength or all these other virtues you might need to demonstrate insofar as you live with other people and have to negotiate, navigate a social space with them. Instead, you'll have this other sphere separate from all of this, where nothing bad can happen to you and you can't lose everything overnight, roughly speaking. Okay, I think we've said enough. I've certainly gone longer than I intended to. We've covered the really important points that I wanted to touch on, and we'll just have to leave the rest where it lies. Thank you for joining me.